Okay. Wow, seems like we have quite a few of you here already. We're super excited. Thank you for joining us. Oop, I don't know why I keep disappearing, but I keep disappearing. Apologize for that. Um, yeah, so welcome everyone. I am Jessica Roberts. I am the Director of Habitat Connectivity here at Wild Virginia. And I'm super excited to be here and introduce our guest today. Just a few things before we start the webinar. Um, so this is being recorded, so it will be posted to Wild Virginia's YouTube channel, so just be aware of that. We will also be sending the recording out to everyone in a follow-up email after the webinar, so you will have that access to that. Any links or anything that we have today, we will also include in that follow-up email. So like I said, I'm the Director of Habitat Connectivity here at Wild Virginia. And so this is just what you see here on the page is a brief overview of the different conservation areas that Wild Virginia works on. We are a state-based conservation organization. So I run the Habitat Connectivity Program, which includes getting protected corridors and road crossings put in place in Virginia. But we also have a water quality program and a pipeline program, and lots, obviously, of webinars just like this for educational programs on a wide variety of wildlife, conservation topics, water quality topics. And we also do quite a bit of advocacy and lobbying for better conservation legislation in Virginia, which I will actually add a link to our chat and the follow-up email. For an event we have actually next week where you can learn to contribute to habitat connectivity through Virginia's legislation. So with that, I also wanted to mention if you have a question throughout any time during Nicole's chat, please do put it in the Q&A section of this webinar. So don't try not to put it in the chat. If you do, it's no big deal, but try to put it in the Q&A section because that's how we can really keep track of your questions. And we're going to have a moderated Q&A session at the end of Nicole's talk. So again, at any time, if you come up with a question that you want Nicole to answer at the end, please do put it in that Q&A section. And yeah, without further ado, I would love to introduce you all to our lovely our lovely guest speaker today. Nicole is a PhD student at Virginia Tech, and she's doing some really exciting research on bobcats and black bears that she's going to share with us today, which contributes a lot to the knowledge that we need in order to put protected habitat corridors and road crossings in the right locations that benefit wildlife. Research like Nicole's is essential to that. And then after Nicole's talk, I'm actually going to show you on our Habitat Connectivity Hub where you can find information about her program. So again, I'll do that at the end of her talk, but we do have Virginia's Habitat Connectivity Hub, which I'm going to link in the chat as well. So please do explore that. It's all information on Virginia and habitat connectivity that you want or need. And Nicole's research is on there, which is really awesome. So thank you so much, Nicole, for being here. We are thrilled to have you, and take it away.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm just gonna share my slides real quick. All right, here we go. Okay, so my name's Nicole, like Jess said, and I'm a PhD student at Virginia Tech and a collaborator of Wild Virginia and other people working on habitat connectivity throughout Virginia. So I'm really excited to tell you today about my PhD research with bobcat and black bear corridors around Virginia. So a little bit about me. I've always been interested in wildlife and ecology. I started as an undergrad at Notre Dame, where I worked actually mostly with water quality and agricultural runoff. But then I quickly switched over to more the wildlife side, and I've worked in a lot of different regions and parts of the world with plague and prairie dogs. in South Dakota with endangered numbats in Australia, which are just a small marsupial with only two populations left in the world, as well as mule deer fawn survival in Nebraska. Before I started my master's at Southern Illinois University, where I really got my start with carnivores and also working with spatial data in more of the GPS and kind of habitat world. So I looked at responses in home range size and habitat selection to human modification with bobcats and coyotes in Illinois, as well as adjustments in their movement indicating fawn predation and specialization for more of the applied management side. And then I immediately moved on to Virginia Tech to start my PhD. I got this great opportunity to start this project with habitat connectivity and wildlife corridors around Virginia, starting just with bobcats, and then I was able to add black bears in this past year. And so what I'm doing is focusing on how we are approaching habitat connectivity throughout the country with kind of a review of what efforts are being done today. And then the second phase of my dissertation is what I'll talk about today, which is improving wildlife corridor modeling methods through better integrating aspects of animal behavior and landscape ecology using bobcats and bears in Virginia. In addition, I will be doing some more work on individual variation leading to spatial personalities in these animals, which can tell us a little bit more about what the individuals within populations are doing on the landscape. So just a brief introduction into this kind of subfield of conservation work. So spatial ecology has to deal with animal movement, and movement is the intersection between animal and its environment. So it can tell you both about the environment and about the animal and its reactions to the world around it. And a lot of that has to do with heterogeneity in the environment, which is just variation in the distribution of resources and risk, which can be anything from things that it needs for shelter, food, and also human or non-human risk sources. And so something that a lot of people are studying today is how animals deal with habitat fragmentation, which is just smaller and more spread apart habitat patches. So specifically, what we're looking at is habitat connectivity. And as we know, we're experiencing a biodiversity crisis. And a lot of that has to do with intensive land use change and human spread throughout the country and the world. And a lot of potential solutions have to do with protecting land and promoting habitat connectivity, which is the degree that organisms can move unimpeded across their habitats. And this has gotten a lot of attention in the past 5 to 10 years with a lot of global and national and local efforts, such as the E.O. Wilson Foundation Half Earth Project, which is a global initiative, as well as some national initiatives and legislation. And in Virginia, one of the biggest examples is the recent Virginia Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, which just has to do with planning how we can promote connectivity within the state. However, a lot of this focus that goes into these projects has been on large-scale migrations and connecting protected areas, such as with really huge ungulate, so hoofed animal like deer and elk migrations across huge expanses of open land, such as in the Western US. But there's been a lot less connectivity effort in more fragmented mixed use areas in places like Virginia, which represents a lot of the East Coast in being a much more mixed use, population dense, and doesn't have as many protected areas. So one way to think about connectivity, the kind of traditional way, is structural habitat connectivity, where you predetermine some sort of good habitat, such as the trees in this case, and then model the connections between them where the larger patches and closer together patches have stronger connections. So it would look something like this, where these patches with more trees have more connections or stronger connections. And an example of that is found within the Virginia Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, where a lot of the planning has gone into trying to find these like shortest, easiest, straightest connections between existing protected areas, which can be really efficient um, in trying to kind of gather land to connect these areas. However, there's another kind of um, newer idea of habitat connectivity called functional habitat connectivity, where you use data from animals on the ground to tell you how they're connecting patches of habitat. So here you can see these bobcats are moving in a different way than was predicted with the functional or the structural connectivity model. And functional connectivity can sometimes reveal more unexpected results, like, for example, grassland wasn't a predetermined good habitat in the other model, but bobcats are using grassland in this example, and they were able to navigate around a small town to get to more habitat, which sometimes in a structural model we wouldn't expect to be able to occur. So one reason that functional habitat connectivity is really important is it can integrate heterogeneous landscapes, so landscapes with a lot of different habitat or land uses found within them, such as working lands, which are land used for farming, ranching, forestry, etc. And these heterogeneous landscapes can provide habitat for a diversity of species and makes up a huge portion of the East Coast, Virginia, and the entire country. Almost half of the continental US is composed of working lands. So if we're able to integrate that into habitat conservation, we can really increase the biodiversity that we're able to protect, as well as increase public engagement and stewardship since these are private lands. So just a little bit of background on bobcats. They are a small, strictly carnivorous predator, about 10 to 35 pounds. And they're considered habitat generalists. They're found in forest, grassland, desert, and edge habitat all throughout the continental US. They made a recent population recovery. This map was not previously super purple, but with restrictions on hunting and trapping, and less interest in hunting and trapping for fur in the past century, they've really made a comeback. And even though they're habitat generalists, they do avoid high density human populations, and they are mostly nocturnal and crepuscular, which is active at dawn and dusk, which is why a lot of people, even though they live around them, never see them. In addition, black bears are a different kind of carnivore. They're omnivorous, so they eat meat and plants, and are obviously much bigger, so they represent a different kind of size class as bobcats. They're also habitat generalists, but are more found in kind of like strictly kind of thick vegetation areas, but they are able to live in semi-urban areas, which can sometimes lead to human wildlife conflict. They're mostly diurnal, and they're also experiencing a population increase in many areas in the US. So I am covering a few specific questions in my dissertation to try to promote a better model of showing connectivity with actual real life animal data. So the first major question we have is, at what scale do animals perceive the landscape? So for example, we're trying to get at how a bear or a bobcat sees these like habitat patches, which are kind of abstract and kind of like a human concept. Um, but in reality, we want to see if are bears selecting areas or traveling through areas in corridors at more of a fine grain, so like this small patch of trees in the top thought bubble, or at a coarse grain, more of the landscape scale where they have lots of different things that they could choose from. The second big question is how much behavioral variation is within the population. So in this first bobcat, you can see it has really kind of winding movements, and also it's pretty much only sticking around trees. So that's kind of one type of movement behavior, and as well like resource preference that Bobcat 1 has. Bobcat 2 here has a much more straight trajectory, so it has different types of movements from the first Bobcat. And it also kind of sticks on this edge between trees and grass. So what we want to know is, how can we quantify how much variation in these types of movements and preferences are within these animal populations? And if there are multiple groups, which we would call different spatial personalities, how representative is kind of glomming the entire population together and trying to decide wildlife corridors based on that? Or should we take into account these different groups to create a kind of corridor trajectory that we think is representative of all these different preferences found within the population? And the third question is, when and where do they exhibit travel behavior? So in this example, this bear starts its path by foraging in this patch of berries where it spends 6 GPS points. So let's say a point is taken every hour from its collar. And so it spends 6 hours in this berry patch. And then it spends 3 hours traveling to a second patch of trees where it takes a little nap and rests for 5 hours. And so, what we are wondering is, what are the different states? So, is it foraging, traveling, resting that this bear spends its time doing? And also, which of these states are more important for corridors? So, how can we isolate these kind of travel behaviors or something like that, that a an animal would spend moving through an area to get to another one, in which we would designate a corridor to protect that travel? And if we use all of these points, we might get a lot of these trees, which are good for habitat. But if we're trying to protect travel corridors, we want to target these other types of habitat that they are actually using for travel. And then the last big question is, how does the level of heterogeneity affect movement or selection that an animal does? So here we have two kind of examples. There's a homogeneous forest, which will probably support mostly species that thrive in these dense forest environments. And then we have a heterogeneous landscape, which we think that these many different habitat types may support many different species or travel for many different species, that they're able to use on their way to another habitat patch where they might establish a home range or something. So the theory here is that more diversity may be supported with heterogeneous environments, which is kind of where this like working land heterogeneous idea comes to play, that we might want to integrate that more into these corridors or protected areas. So we have these 4 project goals that I just talked about. And really the main questions to come from this are, what features promote habitat connectivity on the landscape? And also the goal of this portion of my dissertation is, what can we account for that will make models of corridor results more accurate to what animals actually are doing and need for corridors and connectivity on the ground in real life? So all goes down to, where and how are animals traveling, and how can we better promote connectivity? So just a little bit of info about the data collection that I've done the past 2 years, collaring bobcats in Albemarle County. So everybody loves some fieldwork pictures and bobcat pictures. So first we went around to a lot of different private and public land and used trail cameras to identify sites with bobcats. So we looked for areas that I know that bobcats like to hang out around, ridges and drainages, areas with rock outcroppings, edges between fields and forests, stuff like that. And here's an example of a little bobcat paw print. We might look for tracks and scat around the area as well to see a good spot to put a camera and confirm whether a bobcat's there. So here's kind of two good pictures that we got on camera of bobcats. And then once we confirm that one is there, we can set a trap. So these are just cage traps um, that are pretty large, larger than your average, like raccoon trap or whatever you might have seen, where we bait it with venison, duck, um, squirrel, chicken, any kind of good stuff that bobcats are interested in, as well as visual attractants, which every cat is the same. Your house cat and a bobcat is interested in the same thing. So we put cat toys, a version of catnip, feathers, all kinds of colored jingly things. I do glittery plastic ornaments hanging in the back that's shiny, that cats love, as well as scent lures that are designed to catch bobcats. Um, Cover it with some leaves and a tarp to make it nice and cozy. And check it every morning to see if a bobcat is inside. And we have some examples, one that's kind of sticks and leaves in the woods, and also another one that's kind of in a grassy field where we're covering it with a lot of grass. And most mornings look like this, which is some sort of what we call bycatch, which is not a target species. Raccoons, possums, and skunks are our most common. And we just let them go. They get a free hotel stay overnight and a free snack of chicken or whatever. But even though they're very cute, what we're really looking for is to catch a bobcat. So this is what they look like when they are in the trap. So on the right hand side, we are compressing the bobcat so I can hand inject it with a sedative because they can't be handled while they are awake. Um, and once the bobcat falls asleep, then this lower picture is an example of our setup. So we take a bunch of measurements, weights, demographic information. Is it a male or female, yearling or adult? We're monitoring its temperature the whole time. And the main goal, is to put a collar on, which is the picture at the top with the GPS um, device at the top and the battery pack at the bottom. And it tracks these bobcats for a year, taking a GPS point every 2 hours. So we put that on, take a couple other samples, like a tissue, a whisker, and a fecal sample, for example, as well as a blood sample when we can get it. And then we reverse the drugs, let them recover a little bit in the trap, and then send them on their way that day. And this is a little bit about what the workup looks like. So we take a look at their teeth. That helps us age them and sense their kind of overall physical condition. The top picture, I'm taking a blood sample out of its leg. And then the bottom, this is a bobcat that we actually caught using a wildlife underpass going under 64. So VDOT has an awesome wildlife underpass trial that's going on under a major highway in Virginia. And we knew a ton of bobcats were using it. And I was so happy that we finally caught one that was using it so we could kind of track its movements on both sides of the highway. So that's my team working that one up. And yeah, so shout out to my awesome two teams of technicians who helped me over the years. This is just a map of Albemarle County with some conservation easements in green, so you can kind of get an idea of different properties, as well as Shenandoah in blue. And we looked at 27 different properties, I believe, over the 2 years, looking for bobcats. And the pink properties are ones where we set cameras, but we didn't end up seeing any. The orange are ones where we saw bobcats, set traps, but didn't actually catch any. And the yellow are properties where we actually caught and collared bobcats. So a few properties caught 2 bobcats, but we got them pretty far spread out across the county, which was awesome. So overall, over the 2 years, we trapped 17 bobcats, 5 females and 12 males, as well as 5 yearlings and 12 adults, and got a good distribution of ones who lived in forests and others in mixed use areas because I wanted to get a good sample of ones that are living in different habitats as well as different demographics. And I am not done collecting data yet. I'm done trapping, but the callers are taking data until this coming April. So we have 23,000 GPS points so far from these bobcats, but there will still be thousands more coming until the callers drop off after their year of tracking. And these are 6 of the bobcats that we caught, some of the most photogenic ones. So yeah, right now we're in the phase of tracking these bobcats. I check on some of them once in a while with radio equipment, and that's also how I can retrieve the collars after their drop-off releases the collar after a year. And then I get maps with live data points that look like that, where each bobcat is in a different color spread out across the county. And in addition, I was able to get access to data that was collected by another team from Virginia Tech in Bath County. They had collared bobcats and black bears that they were able to share that data with me, as well as DWR collared black bears around the Piedmont region of Virginia. So I now have data that covers both forests and mixed use in mountains and Piedmont throughout Virginia from bobcats and black bears, roughly covering the entire area that I've circled on this map. And so I'm really able to kind of extrapolate what would have just been data from Albemarle County to a huge portion of Virginia, which I'm super grateful for. So the next stages are modeling the corridors and providing conservation recommendations for anyone to use with management based on my findings. So yeah, that's the whole kind of flow. Um, and I just wanted to give you some anecdotes about what we've observed so far from these bobcats in Albemarle County. So one easy conclusion is that wildlife corridors are needed. Roads are a huge barrier. 3 of my 17 collared bobcats have been killed by cars thus far. And here's a map of 2 that were like pretty close to each other on the same road. And another one that's actually on much less of a major road. So it doesn't matter the size, any road can be a hazard. And some bobcats are unwilling to make that risk. So some try to cross many times, and eventually are unsuccessful, or they are successful, at least while I'm know what they're up to. And others, roads are a huge barrier and they refuse to even try. So here's 3 examples of major roads that 3 different bobcats view as too risky to cross. In addition, we know that bobcats use highway underpasses. That one that I showed earlier stuck around the highway for a while and used that underpass many times. So here's some points on both sides of the highway. It eventually dispersed because it was a yearling, but we got really awesome data on what it was up to while it was in the vicinity. In addition, we know that bobcats will travel far and across a variety of habitats. So here are 2 different bobcats, and to orient you, the left box is Waynesboro and the right box is Charlottesville. And these bobcats walked back and forth across a 24-mile distance and an 18-mile distance, respectively. So even though they're small, they'll definitely cover a lot of ground, and wildlife corridors are needed to keep them safe while they're doing all of these long distance travels, excuse me. And in addition, we know that bobcats in this population vary in their behavior. So these are some quick kind of informal home ranges for each cat. And these 2 boxes are really like kind of exclusively forested areas. These ones are hanging out in mixed use areas, and we even have some on right on the edge of Charlottesville who are using these kind of exurban, suburban habitats. And in addition, they have a lot of movement kind of preferences. We have a few that are residents that have established home ranges that they don't like to leave. But they can be made up of different habitats. So the upper one lives on a mountain with forest and never leaves, and another one uses this mixed use farmland. Others make repetitive long distance movements. This is the same one that I showed earlier, that crosses 24 miles or something. Others have established home ranges and then move and establish another one. And some are just transient. This is the one that we caught on the highway underpass, and he hung around there a while. Then you can follow these dots all the way down and then up to another kind of area for a while, then up to this other corner. And so he's definitely covering a lot of ground. So going back to my three major kind of sources of investigation that I was talking about earlier, these travel behaviors or behaviors that are important for corridor use. We call that behavioral states. So I'll show you a little bit about how I am looking into this. So we use information on the movement properties of what these animals are doing, which includes the step length between successive GPS points and the turning angle. So you imagine kind of like 2 hours, 2 hours, 2 hours. They're moving across the landscape in these 2 hour intervals, and we want to know, are they moving fast, which is a long step length, or are they moving slow, which is a shorter step length, which might mean they're kind of resting or foraging. And in addition, kind of travel behavior will be these fast and straight step lengths because they're on a trajectory, they're trying to get somewhere. Whereas if they're kind of hanging out in an area, it's the core of their home range or something, they'll be short and tortuous, like winding steps, which kind of tells us that they're not doing this like travel behavior. And so we run this through some software that tells us about switches in these properties, which will tell us the different states, the different behavioral states that they're exhibiting. So I'll give you an example. This is one of our bears. And it's kind of hard to see, but there's three different states, the orange, the green, and the blue. And they're all kind of jumbled up in this area. But what we're doing is extracting these resting states, so these small clumps where they're not really moving or it's very winding, where we think the bear is resting. And we're testing just throwing that out and seeing what happens because we want to retain those foraging or traveling behavioral states to really tell us about corridor movement. And we're also using all this GPS data to tell us about resource selection. So this tells us the different habitat types that the animals are selecting more than is available on their environment. So if there's just a tiny patch of trees, a tiny patch of forest, but they spend relatively more time there than in other areas, that tells us that they're selecting for that forest. So our bobcat data collection is not complete, but thus far what we're getting is that bobcats select for areas closer to forest, closer to grassland, pasture, and crop areas, and with higher heterogeneity like we had hypothesized. And they are avoiding primary and secondary roads. So those are major roads and big highways. And they feel neutral towards local and unpaved roads. So they don't view it as potentially as much of a risk. Or even unpaved roads can be used by them for travel. So that's not super surprising. And so what this tells us is that they like edge habitat. So this heterogeneous kind of environment where there's grassland, heterogeneity, forest, all kinds of different resources. that we find bobcats hanging around these edges between habitat types. And with bears thus far, we're seeing that they're selecting forest, grassland, pasture, and crop, just like bobcats, but they're also selecting for development. So they do like those kind of suburban, exurban areas. In addition, they're actually attracted to secondary and unpaved roads, and they like ridges. Um, and then they're avoiding heterogeneity, which is kind of surprising. They seem to like more homogeneous, like more habitat type environments. And they avoid primary and local roads. So some of these kind of road results are a little bit surprising with the bears, as well as avoiding heterogeneity and selecting for development. So these bears have different types of behaviors than bobcats, which can tell us a lot to have two different species with different behaviors. So a little bit more into how we actually get these corridor models. So what we're taking is this GPS data that we're also narrowing down to travel behavior, as well as landscape features like land use, roads, water, elevation, all this stuff that I was just talking about with forest, crop, development, all that kind of stuff. As well as landscape heterogeneity, which we quantified ourselves with how many different habitats are around each pixel of one habitat. And in the future, we'll be categorizing this behavioral variation that I talked about in the beginning within the population to compare whether that's useful to informing how a population level corridor model goes. And we put it in this program called CircuitScape. So we take this selection information that I just showed you, and we put it into this program called CircuitScape, which models animal movement um, in a way that it kind of creates a connectivity map that makes connectivity act like electrical current. So areas that are selected that are considered good habitat based on our selection information is high conductance. And high resistance would be areas that they avoid or that they don't like. So it spits out a map like this where we have a spectrum of colors where one side of the spectrum shows you the best possible connections between areas, and the other side of the color spectrum tells you about these are the worst possible options that are probably not going to promote connectivity. And it spits you out with a map like at the bottom, which is an example with tigers that someone did, where it's hard to see, but there's these dark green blobs around the map, and those are protected areas or tiger kind of sanctuary areas. And then high connectivity is shown by these yellow parts of the connections, and low connectivity is these cooler blue colors. So you can see some of these connections are really bright yellow, really great. And then at the top of the map, you see a lot of blue connecting different protected areas, which might not be so great and may indicate that tigers are not really able to cross these areas. So I'm doing something similar with these bobcat and bear data. And the bears aren't finished yet, so I can't tell you more than their general selection thus far. This is gonna take me 4 years in total, 4 to 5 years to do my PhD, so not done yet, but I can tell you about bobcats. So we are doing this kind of stepwise thing where I have the base model with none of those four improvements that I discussed, which would represent kind of like a classic corridor model. And then I'm adding one of my elements to each different model version, and then we'll compare the results to kind of show us what of the elements that I added is actually making the models better. So I'm going to show you 3 different iterations. The first one is this kind of base model with none of the elements that I talked about that are fun and special and that we hope help. Model one contains all behavioral states and doesn't have heterogeneity as a portion. So we're just looking at all of these different habitat types that they're selecting, and just putting that in and seeing what it says. So to orient you, this has the Bath County and Albemarle County bobcats. So our output is going to be a box that encompasses both of those counties. And you can see Charlottesville, Staunton, and I have the National Forest and National Park System areas highlighted in green so you can get an idea of which areas are already protected. And this does go a little bit into West Virginia, so don't get confused by the lack of Virginia borders. And then I have all of these major roads highlighted in black, so you can also see those kinds of barriers on the landscape. So here's our first model. And red is indicated by high connectivity and low connectivity is shown in purple. And right now, the whole edge is red, and that's just because I have to connect these nodes, which in a lot of models are protected areas, but I just have to tell the model what areas am I modeling the connections between. And I need a supercomputer to run the real model that has the entire box covered in nodes where you can see how connections go across the whole one. But for this trial run, we have just the borders. So the edge is going to be super high connectivity because that's where the closest connections are. So you can just kind of like zoom in, ignore that red edge, and kind of look at all of this yellow, green, blue, and purple on the map. And you can see this valley that has Staunton and Harrisonburg is super purple. The bobcats are not likely to be able to cross through here, probably because they're major cities. There's not a lot of vegetative cover. And since it's so human dominated, there's actually not a lot of heterogeneity. Whereas it's higher ranked around Charlottesville. Actually, let me get this pointer out. So here's Charlottesville, and all of these areas are way more higher heterogeneity. And so we have the kind of grassland that they like. It has the forest that they like. It doesn't have a ton of major roads in here. So even though we don't have heterogeneity in this model, you can kind of see that the types of edge habitats that bobcats are popping up as higher connectivity in this example. There's also higher connectivity, of course, in these protected areas, which has a lot that they like. And the colors get cooler around these major roads because they do not like these primary and secondary roads. So I will show you the second version, which does not include resting points. So we're just considering travel behavior in this case, and there's still no heterogeneity. But you can kind of see if I flip back and forth, we do have some red areas now in between these protected areas. So now that we're only including travel behavior, it does rank these areas a little bit differently. So that does make a difference, deleting these resting points from consideration. And then the third one, where we have no resting points and heterogeneity, looks super different. So an explanation for this is that the Piedmont kind of region is starting over here, and that has higher heterogeneity. And it's actually ranking these protected forested areas in cooler colors, so it's lower ranked because it's so homogeneous forest, which bobcats like, but they really like edge habitat. So they are sticking to being able to travel kind of in these other areas. But you can see that there's still huge barriers around major cities. So that's always going to be a problem, and I'm not really surprised by that at all. But that kind of proves that they're going to have to walk around these areas. And in addition, these major roads, you can see these cooler colors popping up on the borders of these major highways that bobcats are still seeing as barriers. So wildlife crossings or some other kind of protection is going to be necessary to be able to connect these areas that aren't connected otherwise. So, what do we plan to do with all of this information once I have the final versions? So our goal really is to find out how animals move through landscapes in reality, since so much of habitat connectivity work thus far has to do with structural connectivity that doesn't use GPS data to inform it. So we want to kind of add to this discussion of how actual animal data can inform, the types of habitats that we think are good, how they're moving and able to connect these good habitats, and just kind of add to all this knowledge base. And so we hope that by finding what elements actually improve the model, we hope that this can be applied to other target species in other systems so that we're not just talking about bobcats and black bears in Virginia. We can talk about them in other states or totally other species. You can kind of use this framework or these ideas to promote connectivity anywhere. And more practically, we want to provide information for local and state recommendations for conservation and development planning. For example, the Virginia Wildlife Corridor Action Plan that I discussed earlier will be updated in a couple years. And so I will be conveniently finished with my PhD by then. So I'm hoping that all these final results will be able to kind of supplement what they've already done and add to the functional connectivity aspect of the plan to kind of be able to identify other connections that we can make in the state for wildlife or, just kind of help with the discussion of what we can do. And in addition, with the bobcats showing affinity for heterogeneous environments and these kind of grasslands and working lands, I really hope that there's potential for conservation easements and working lands to play a more important role in wildlife corridors, because we don't have to think of untouched forest as the only way that we can retain wildlife habitat. In reality, that's not what a lot of our landscape looks like, so we wanna work with what we have, and also the animals seem to not really prefer those types of habitats anyway. So I'm hoping that this data can add, to people's ideas of what habitat can actually look like. So I wanted to thank you and open it up for questions. This is my email. If you ever want to reach out to me, you can also find me on the hub. And thank you to all my collaborators at the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative, the Smithsonian, DWR over the state, and everyone at Albemarle County. And yeah, all the data, there's been a lot that goes into it, and I really appreciate everyone's collaboration with this project. But yeah, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That is just absolutely fascinating. I am so thrilled to hear that you're doing at circuit method or whatever the modeling is called. That's so cool.
Mhm.
Yeah, and just fascinating. It's also fascinating to say, hey, we need habitat corridors in these working lands because not all wildlife are going to use those like solid patches of forest or solid grassland. I think that's super fascinating. I mean, just amazing research. Real fast, before we go into our questions, I am going to just share with you all because Nicole really lovely mentioned some of our events and that we need to influence potentially the next wildlife quarter action plan. So we do have actually a future events here at Wild Virginia coming up where you can learn about the legislation we want to get passed in the state to increase the chances of getting a wildlife road crossing put in place. We are currently ninth in the nation for wildlife fuel conflict, so we want to prevent that from happening. So this is on the same Eventbrite page for Wild Virginia. Please do register. I'll put the link in the chat as well. And also, I'll also re-put the link in the chat for Virginia's Habitat Connectivity Hub. And if you go to our topic-based table of contents, down to the biodiversity section, you can actually skip right to Nicole's research section, learn again a little bit all about her research. We have it there. And then she also mentioned, again, the Wildlife Quarter Action Plan. We have a great summary of that in the hub as well, so you can learn about that and everything that has to do there. So I will put those links in the chat for you. So I'm going to hand it over to our lovely interns if you guys want to moderate questions for Nicole.
Thank you. So our first question is about the GPS tracking collars, and it's how long do the battery packs last? And do you go out and recollect the collars after the study or before the batteries need replacing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the batteries are supposed to last, well, they usually last anywhere between 9 to 12 months. And we have a drop-off mechanism that we start the timer the moment that we collar the bobcat, so that day. And the bear collars work the same way, but for the bobcats, because the battery has limited life, we have a drop off after a year. And even when the GPS stops working, the radio signals are still active. So I'm able to use that antenna and equipment to locate the collars and collect them. Almost all of the data gets transmitted to my kind of online site via the satellite, where I can download the data immediately. It transmits all 12 points that I took that day once a day. But sometimes there's gaps or whatever where the satellite isn't connecting. So I try to collect the collar so I can get the full data that's stored on board. The bear collars can last for 2 to 3 years because they have much bigger battery packs. But they work in the same way where many of them these days are required to drop off. So around the end of the battery life estimation, you can drop off and collect them.
Thank you. The next question is, would trapping in underpasses potentially discourage those individuals and their families from continuing to use the underpass?
Yeah, that's a great question and something that I wondered before I started trapping. But the thing is that we um collared many bobcats, and I collared more in Illinois before I even started here. And we're getting them on collar or on camera after being collared, passing in front of the trap that they were caught in all the time. And also using their GPS points, I can see that most of the time they stay in the same area. An exception is yearlings, which usually disperse out of their mother's home range. And so they usually leave the area anyway. After a couple months of being collared. So I found that they're not really discouraged from an area, and the one that we caught did continue to use the underpass for quite some time, but he's transient, so I don't think it was us that discouraged him. He stuck around for about 4 months, I think, before he started to travel a little bit more. So they see a safe way, but they just don't even look at the trap. After they're caught, they're like, I am not interested anymore. I don't care how good that trap smells. So they'll walk right past it, but they won't go in again.
And I believe you've touched on this, but how far will bobcats travel and what is considered their home territory?
Yeah, so most of them do establish home ranges. They can be anywhere from like 2 to 25, 30 square miles usually. If they're in kind of a really desolate habitat with not a lot of resources, they'll get bigger and bigger home ranges. And they'll also disperse as adults, even if they're not getting a lot, and they'll select a new home range. And so in Illinois, I had one cat that dispersed 100 miles to Indiana while it was collared. So they can travel really far distances if they want to find a new place to hang out. But most of them will disperse at least a couple miles after a year to establish their own territory out of their mother's range. And usually males will disperse farther. But yeah, a couple miles is average, but things can push them way farther.
Thank you. The next question is, how will climate change impact wildlife travel patterns? Oops, sorry, it disappeared from me. Um, in the area. And then this person has also seen projections that the Central Appalachians will be a national hotspot for wildlife migration.
Yeah, so a lot of species will start either moving north or moving up in elevation, so that's definitely accurate. I can see some more temperature sensitive species like I'm trying to think of an example, like smaller animals. I mean, bobcats and black bears are pretty resilient. They go almost, all the way to Mexico, so they're able to withstand different temperatures. But you might see things that are more temperature sensitive, or for example, things like salamanders and stuff, they won't have as much water available. They will definitely start moving and towards areas that will have the resources that they need. So I can see a lot of things moving higher in elevation, or even kind of selecting for more vegetation with shade. I'm thinking of, these like 90-degree plus days that we got for a long time over the summer in Virginia. Um, Animals will definitely be affected by that. They might not move as much to conserve energy and stay cool. And so, yeah, I think we will really see effects, maybe not as much with bobcats and black bears, but a lot of different species.
The next question says that you focused around Charlottesville, but highlighted Harrisonburg and other major roads like 81, which is a huge impediment to animals crossing. Are there plans for Harrisonburg to add under or overpasses? And what about the JMU underpass?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the state-wide underpass. I know there's kind of plans. I know that VDOT has trials running in a few different places, and yeah, JMU and some other people are also working on how animals use culverts that aren't really designated wildlife underpasses, but animals could use those, which I have seen bobcats kind of check out other paths. That kind of depends on species that are more bold and more able to kind of go through small spaces. But yeah, I think Virginia is definitely at the forefront of habitat connectivity and wildlife underpass work. Um, so I'm not sure about all the specifics, but
I can help
yeah,
answer that one.
yeah. Go ahead.
So currently, no, there are no plans to put underpasses or overpasses. So this is a great question. And a big thing of why I do what I do at Wild Virginia is we're trying to encourage our state agencies to require that they consider wildlife passage, both terrestrial and aquatic, when they do any sort of infrastructure planning. And currently, right now, our state agencies don't have to, and so they're not. Even though we are ninth in the nation for wildlife fuel conflict, it's a large issue for sure. And we have things like the Shenandoah and Appalachia, which are these huge, movement ways for all of this wildlife. So it's becoming quite a large issue in Virginia. So again, if you'd like to get involved with influencing our legislators to get these crossings put in place, please do become a Wild Virginia member. So that was a great. I'm gonna actually leave it there because it is 7:30. We will, in the follow-up email, include the recording to this and also Nicole's email. So if you didn't get your questions answered, feel free to email Nicole with your questions. But just really, please join me in thanking Nicole for this really wonderful talk outlining her research and just how incredibly important it is to better conserve our species and have less human wildlife conflict in Virginia and also across the world. So thank you so much, Nicole. Really just wonderful job. This is great.
Thank you so much for being a great audience and for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Yay. Okay. All right. So, like I said, please look out for that follow up email with all the links and Nicole's email and the recording. And we'll be sending that out to you soon. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you to Kylie and our wonderful Wild Virginia interns for helping out tonight. Everybody, have a great evening.